Hi, my name is Rachel Lance, and I'm excited to be here with you guys tonight. And in partly because any excuse to talk about history is a great one, but importantly because a lot of our country's history and the world's history resides in archives. So being asked to do this for the U.S. National Archives was a really exciting opportunity for me to talk about where these stories live, where they get hidden after they happen, and how we can bring them back to life and reveal them as the fascinating narratives. The original program was supposed to be more of a conversational format between myself and fellow author Alex Kershaw. He's had some last minute difficulties, so we're going to go ahead and get started. And we're going to be talking about a couple different aspects of World War II today. We just passed the 80th anniversary of D-Day, the landings at Normandy, and I recently had the opportunity to use a huge amount of archival documents to write an aspect of that story of the heroism related to D-Day that I've never seen discussed anywhere before. A lot of this story comes from the US National Archives. The rest of it comes from either the National Library of Scotland or the UK National Archives. So basically all a mixture of these different libraries who each held a piece of this puzzle. Okay, so first, just a tiny bit about me. I won't belabor myself too long, but this is me on an average workday. I work at Duke University, although I'm transitioning out of that position, but this is inside of one of our 7 hyperbaric chambers. A hyperbaric chamber is a thick-walled, pressure-containing structure. And these structures are usually made out of steel, and they're designed to hold in or hold out huge pressure differentials. So in this particular experiment, I'm doing an outer space experiment, a high altitude and outer space experiment. So I'm breathing pure oxygen to stay conscious in there. But we also use these to conduct science and diving. This whole project started because there was an old piece of paper, an old academic publication that was related to the science of diving that happened in 1941. And when a paper comes out is usually a year after that work was completed. So something about this really bothered me because it was British. In 1940, in Britain, they were being bombed. So I couldn't quite figure out what the rest of the narrative was and why they cared about this weird aspect of carbon dioxide breathing as they're being bombed in Britain. And to figure it out, I went to one of my favorite places, which is the National Archives, because I think every piece of science has its historical context. So the answer to that big burning question is that what they were actually working on was figuring out how to create a beach landing on a large scale that could work eventually to take the war to Hitler and Finland. To start that narrative, we're going to start us off with a totally different French town. This is an old pre-war photograph of the beach and the casino building at Dieppe, France. So also in the Normandy region, but a different area from the eventual landings of D-Day. Now you can see this is kind of a beautiful tourist town. Wealthy people did in fact go here for, not only decades, but centuries to make it part of their vacation plan. They would stroll on the beach. They would admire these soaring white cliffs in the background. And one thing about this easy, sleepy beach access town is that once the war breaks out, these are the towns that are going to become prime targets because they're not connected to any massive cities. They're therefore not connected to any surprise areas that could be a source of major troop reinforcements for the Nazis. So when the Allies are starting to realize that eventually they have to get across the channel, they have to have a landing in mainland Europe that'll safely allow them to proceed inward toward Hitler and toward Hitler's main headquarters. They're going to have to try and target some of these formerly paradisical beach. One of the features you can see in the background that's characteristic of Dieppe and becomes key to World War II in a horrifying way are these soaring, famous white cliffs. They're back in the upper right of this photo. These cliffs are so famous that even Claude Monet was obsessed with them. He would paint them. He had almost a dozen paintings of just the cliffs of Dieppe, which you can see in his painting off to the right corner of these picturesque, beautiful ones. He even used the possessive about them and called them his, like he owned them. Well, as the Allies are starting to have warfare, they realize that the cliffs are going to be the buttresses to form the site of their first major attempted beach landing. Winston Churchill knew that this was going to be a bad idea. The infamously stubborn British bulldog told the Allies over and over again, don't do this. This is a bad plan. You're not ready for a beach landing. This is going to go poorly. The reason he knew this was because he'd been in charge of one before. He'd been one of the leading officers at a beach landing at Gallipoli during World War I, when he'd, of course, been much younger. But that one went so terribly that it's stuck in his memory forever. Everyone got stuck on the beach. Everyone ended up subjected to not only the extreme cold, but the extreme hot because of the length of time that they were stuck on the beach. They were there for months, almost a year. And they had problems with starvation because it was still an active combat zone. And meanwhile, nobody could figure out a way to get off the shores. So when World War II comes around, when it becomes clear that eventually this war will need to be taken to the mainland, Winston Churchill is among a small number who know beach landings are not as easy as they look. But the rest of the Allies push ahead anyway. The Canadians have largely been sitting unused in the UK, waiting for their opportunity. And they tell the rest of the Allies a little bit brusquely, use us in this war or send us back home. We're not enjoying ourselves just sitting around here. The Russians as well in the east are being hammered by the Axis forces, and they're being exerting a lot of pressure on the Allies to try and open a second front in the West. They're saying, we need help. We need you to divide these forces. We need you to open something in the West to distract them, pull them away from our front. The target, which is shown here in this declassified report from the US National Archives, I did properly put that declassification marker in there for you guys, was Dieppe, France. This is actually a photograph taken from many years before, obviously. There are beautiful shade tints here. There are people lounging. We have some very glamorous ladies wearing their sun hats in the bottom of the frame. That's because this is a photograph of what the beach looked like before the war even occurred. It's a photograph of people on vacation. This is one of only 3 photographs in this entire planning report used to plan the landings. This photograph was considered useful because it had a bit more information about where the beach walls were, the distance of the shore. But one of the things that becomes critical to the landing that is still not even evident in this one, even though it was considered one of the more useful tools they had, is the actual type of the beach itself. As well, unsurprisingly, the Germans have made additional plans since the outbreak of war, no longer limited to a simple holiday town. The beaches of Dieppe have been reinforced. There are now machine gun nests behind there. The houses are filled with machine guns. They've put batteries at the top of the cliffs. And as you can see here from a photograph that was taken years later, they've dug into the very cliffs themselves. These 3 dark holes along the edges of Monet's famous white walls are now caves filled with machine guns and German personnel carrying guns, other weapons, and grenades. So when this landing occurs on August 19th, 1942, perhaps unsurprisingly to us with a modern eye, it is an absolute and unmitigated disaster. We don't really hear about it in American history classes. And one of my opinions is because it was so horrifying and so poorly thought through. This is a painting preserved by the National Archives that shows the aftermath. And I think this is a little bit interpretive because it was done by an American artist, or at least preserved by American record keepers. And it shows what happened. The ships were beached. The troops were all killed as they were trying to unload the tanks. The tanks threw off their tracks because unable to see what type of beach surface it was, it turned out not to be sand, but small rocks. The rocks got into treads. The treads were thrown off. Some of the tanks even turned up upside down or just started catching on fire. Obviously not incredibly functional. Meanwhile, the German gunners in those cliffs dug in high above where Monet had once painted were able to pick off the targets of struggling Allied troops far down below, throwing grenades at them, shooting downward at them. And Not a single troop is really known to have made to get it into town. The officers of the Allied military were stationed offshore. They had a smoke screen that was meant to protect them from enemy fire, but it also meant they couldn't see what was happening. And so they just kept sending wave after wave after wave to die. Meanwhile, in 1942, the war is raging in the rest of Europe. This is another image preserved by the National Archives of one of the very common sights of the time, which is people of Britain, especially in London, sleeping in the tube stations. They have at this point had over 2 years without reprieve. They've been bombed fairly constantly. They've had bombs near their homes. Their friends and neighbors have died. Those who were able to evacuate already did so long ago. So the people who are staying behind are the people who don't have the resources to have that choice. There are also a lot of the ones who are keeping some of these factories running. It's easy to relocate a single person. It's hard to relocate a factory. So as the war rages on, many of these planning areas and structures are kept in London downtown, and these people, instead of deal with the nightly risk, simply resign themselves to sleeping in the tube stations, where they say they may not be perfectly safe. Some tube stations were destroyed, but they know at least they won't be able to hear it. At least here, they'll be able to get a good night of sleep. So obviously, there's a huge amount of pressure for the Allied government to do something to take this war to the mainland. And after that raid on Dieppe, the government realizes that they have a lot of work to do. Now, we're going to rewind just a little bit to set the context and the scale of what the group that they tasked was actually trying to achieve. This picture is from 1938. This is the cutting edge in dive gear in 1938. So this is contemporary. This is what diving looked like. It did exist before the war. It existed throughout the 1800s, but it was a huge operation. It took this massive equipment. It took a surface ship. So after this raid on Dieppe occurs, and the Allies realize they need more information about the beaches in advance, not just what they looked like from someone's vacation photo, but what the Germans have done in the intermediate years, they realize the best possible way to get this without being detected is with divers. But sending in a surface ship, sending in, Cuba Gooding Jr. of Alabama here is not exactly a good way to do this undetected. So what they need to do is figure out a way to cut these cables and send this diver in without being spotted. This is their eventual goal. This diver is using what we call a DSEA, Davis Submarine Escape Apparatus. This young person is training in the art and scrambly panic science at times of escaping from a simulated sunken submarine. Now, they had all of these apparatuses on submarines. This was something that had been invented in the interwar years, and they were issued, but they were never actually tested. They got made out of mine-breathing apparatuses, so mouthpieces and things like that that were used to send people into mines, and then they got just stockpiled on the submarines. So in the summer of 1939, 3 Allied submarines went down in rapid fashion. USS Squalus sank off the coast of New Jersey, the HMS Thetis sank off the coast of the UK, and the French submarine Feeney sank off the coast of Vietnam. Out of the 3 of those, only 4 submariners were able to escape of their own accord. From the HMS Thetis, they used these DSEAs, and they were plucked out of the water nearly dead, not from having drowned, but just from the difficulties of underwater physiology that so far nobody in the Allied countries had bothered to study. This was a huge wake-up call. The Allies realized, we figured out O-rings. We figured out how to waterproof this stuff. But that's not the same as keeping a person alive using it. The person is a variable. How does this person react to the gases? How does this person react to the environment underwater? We can't just send someone off the coast of German-occupied France in this frigid waters of Normandy for the first time, setting the hopes of the entire population of Great Britain and the other Allied countries on their backs and hope for the best without preparation. Enter our unlikely hero. So the gentleman on the left is a British, I don't think he's not royalty, but he's from one of those stories British families that we don't really have in the United States, where they have familial wealth for generations and they have sort of country homes here and summer homes there, and they're able to do what they please. Well, what he pleased, this gentleman named John Burton Sanderson Haldane, who went just by JBS, he pleased to volunteer for warfare. He had been in the First World War. He had been in the trenches. He had experienced 2 very severe injuries during that time period. And also during that time period, his incredible scientist father had had him pulled from the trenches. His father was so powerful that he could get his son off the front lines, and he did it, but not to keep him safe. It was so that the 2 of them could intentionally breathe chlorine gas and mustard gas in their home. They had a gas chamber that they built in their house for experiments. They wanted to see what the Germans were releasing over the trenches, and they wanted to see what they could do to stop it. So that's why you see this man. This is now, at this point, he's had this picture taken. It's 1937. He volunteered for the Spanish Civil War because he understands the horror of warfare, and he wants to do what he can to help stop it in the future. So his sister, Naomi, and their mother, Kathleen, and their father, John, the 4 of them worked together building early gas mask prototypes that we now know were actually functional. So he takes these to the Spanish Civil War, where the same techniques are being used, and he kind of becomes inadvertently this expert in breathing gas, breathing poisons, what happens to the lungs when they're not in the environment they're naturally supposed to be. Which is strange because by training, he's actually a mathematician studying genetics. So when the HMS Thetis goes down, when the Esquelus sinks and the Fani is lost, and none of these submariners, except for 4 who barely make it alive, are able to get out of this watery tubes, JBS Haldane gathers some of his friends from the Spanish Civil War, who are seen here in this newspaper photo, and they decide to test themselves. This is the paper that I actually found that started this whole project. They put themselves in enclosed spaces inside hyperbaric chambers, and they start to measure how long they can be there and what happens to them if they stay there. And they create the simulated effects of an underwater submarine. So when the British Royal Navy is looking at the sinking of the HMS Thetis and they're asking these questions, they really need these answers from a physiologist. And JBS Haldane is able to get up on the stand in this formal courtroom setting, having done the last of these experiments the night before, with his headache still raging from the blinding migraine that he had induced and the projectile vomiting that he had caused in himself in his efforts to test submarine theory. He did the math on the stand in front of everyone to prove what they would have needed to have in the boat and to provide to these personnel to keep them alive. From that point forward, he became the Admiralty's man. He was their scientific head guy. This photograph was very clearly staged based on what they're wearing, because this is far too formal to really do a chamber experiment in. But JBS Haldane is on the right and Martin Case is on the left. And these 2 are now wearing on their chests some of those modified breathing systems, which become known as rebreathers. They are putting themselves in these hyperbaric chambers, being pressurized to death, asking themselves what happens not only to the human body when it goes to pressure, but what happens to me. And they are putting their lungs and their minds on the line for that question. They are not the only members of this group. JBS Haldane is, by this point in time, a professor at the University College London, and he starts to recruit all of the students and all of the personnel in his lab. Shown on the left is Elizabeth German. She is a bright young scientist. She has a degree, a high-ranking degree with honors. She speaks scientific German. She's gotten amazing grades in organic chemistry. And so naturally, they make her the group's secretary. However, Elizabeth German, being the patriotic young athlete that she is not deterred, and she, alongside multiple other women, as well as Jewish refugees who have escaped from the mainland just before the advances of Hitler's forces, volunteer to put themselves in these hyperbaric chambers to answer these questions on behalf of the Royal Navy. On the right, you can see what that would have looked like. They had an upward-facing tube after their initial lab got bombed, and they had to rebuild another one. And the second series had a harness with a rope on the back in case of an emergency. The reason I've highlighted Elizabeth German here is because one day, in this exact chamber, she faced She was dangling down in the water, which is below the tendon's legs. She was suspended from this rope harness. She was on the breathing apparatuses shown in the previous slide. She was testing how they would work in water. The Royal Navy had been increasing their urgency and their sense of had been sending letters and letters over and over. By the way, on the first draft of that book, I accidentally claimed they'd been sending emails. That was not correct. They had been sending letters, but they'd been sending letters to this lab, and the letters, which are archival preserved, sound increasingly desperate, especially after Dieppe. After the rout of Dieppe happens, they're saying, "You guys gotta help us. We need to know what's happening. We're about to just put people in the water." But that day, Elizabeth German's tests upended all of the science done so far. She realized, with her own body, that oxygen underwater behaves differently than oxygen in air. So as she was breathing on her breathing apparatuses, getting lungs full of pure oxygen, she was at a depth of 50 feet. And all of a sudden, with very little warning, except for a squeak and a scribbled attempt to write something on a slate, she began to have a massive seizure. JBS Haldane, who was seated above her on this small platform, tried his best to pull her out of the water while bellowing commands to the outside. They were under pressure. Bringing them to the surface could kill them both immediately. So they had to do it slowly. They had to do it carefully. But they brought her to the surface. They were able to haul her out. They were able to resuscitate her on the platform above. Her experiment that day showed what would have happened had the Admiralty simply sent the people down and hoped for the best, the way that they'd done with the submarines. It showed that there were limits to where these breathing apparatuses could be used, and there were limits to the way that they could be handled underwater. Elizabeth German was the first in a series of test points that demonstrated to the Admiralty what those limits were, so that the Admiralty could then provide them to their divers, and the divers could go out with confidence and know that they were using them safely. Overall, these chamber scientists performed over 611 experiments on themselves, day after day, climbing into the chamber, one after the other. The day of Elizabeth German's massive seizure, another scientist climbed in that same afternoon to run the same profile with the same equipment that had just made her seize, because he was trying to make sure that it wasn't just her they had infected. They had. The early experiments were quickly used by the Admiralty to build what are called X-craft. So that's a photo of one's shown here, and that is the full size. There is nothing more hidden underwater. These X-craft were tiny submarines. They were 40 foot long at their most lengthy external point and only 15 feet top to bottom. They were designed to be able to go above minefields if needed. And the Admiralty started out putting 3 people inside, then 4, then 5. It's easy to imagine how incredibly cramped this would have been, not only with the dimensions of 40 feet by 15 feet, but then with 4 people, you have increasing numbers of people. And then all of a sudden, the missions start to come through. What they want the X-craft for are not just floating above minefields, not just stealth attacks anymore, but actual beach scouting. Full-size submarines cannot get that close to shore without surface craft cannot get that close to shore. And so these X-craft get tagged to scout the beaches of Normandy. They're breathing gas inside, carefully controlled by the prescriptions done, or by the experiments done, and the prescriptions made of the scientists who had done it first on themselves in the chambers to simulate the small gas volume. The X-craft are piloted out to the shores of Normandy on June 4th, 1944. Two of them mark the sides of the British beaches, the X-23 and the X-20. They sit there lying in wait for multiple days. They're sunk to the bottom of the ocean for 18 hours a day in those 3 days before D-Day. On the June 5th, when it's announced that the invasions are delayed, the despair in the crew of the X-craft is palpable through the reports. Sitting on in the small, tiny, cramped vessel for 18 hours a day on the bottom of the shore with no oxygen, or with very little oxygen, but more importantly, slowly creeping levels of carbon dioxide has taken a huge toll on their bodies, even though they are carrying with them the amount of carbon dioxide absorbent prescribed by the chamber experiments. However, on the morning of June 6, 1944, when that invasion does occur, they are able to guide in the British and Canadian troops to Sword and Juno and Gold Beach. The X-craft marking them on their external perimeters mean that, unlike Omaha Beach, the troops do not land astray. They do not land under more cliffs like at Dieppe. They do not land directly under German gun battery like they did at Omaha. Instead, the X-craft have taken their location, come to the surface, refresh their breathing gas, and mark these beaches correctly down to the exact foot. As a result, the casualties on Sword are some of the lowest, partly owing to the fact that there was proper navigation and proper beach marking done ahead of time, so that it would not need to be done by landing troops in the middle of the fray, in the middle of the chaos of being shot at. Several troops, as they approached the beach, saw the X-craft personnel standing with their marking flags on the top of their partially sunken submarine. One thought he was fully hallucinating. He later admitted that he'd taken 4 shots of rum before he went to the landing to give himself a bit of courage. And he thought that maybe this man walking on the water was the product of the rum. After the landing sites are established, the X-craft are finally able to pull back ashore. After 3 days inside their tiny environment, they are exhausted. They pull back ashore, they swap out the crews, so fresh personnel climb inside, and the crews that were in them for the beach landings and the beach markings are able to get some sleep, fully stretched out, and hopefully walk around a bit. The other way that the experiments end up being applied is to send out divers. Both the Royal Navy and the American Navy were working in parallel on better free-swimming divers who are equipped with the scientific knowledge of what their bodies could handle, and breathing apparatuses that were built with this knowledge as well, with the limitations of underwater physiology in mind, as opposed to their previous effort, which was essentially waterproof this thing and hope for the best. This is an image from the U.S. National Archives again, and this is the diver down at Fort Pierce, Florida. Fort Pierce was the training ground for what we now call the Navy SEALs. At that time, it was NCDUs and UDTs, which is Naval Combat Demolition Underwater and Underwater Demolition Team. But these were 2 groups of exploratory personnel. They were trained on these beaches where the Americans had built copies of the infamous German hedgehog and beach barriers that were landed at the beaches of Normandy, so that these personnel could practice with them and practice dismantling them underwater using explosives. The dedication to my book is actually to my grandfather, who was one of the NCDU personnel. He didn't land at Normandy. He landed at the southern French counterpart, which is Operation Dragoon. And he never really talked about it, but one thing he did share that I thought was fun was the test to see that if you got into the NCDU was they would take a bunch of people out on a boat and essentially just shove them all into the water. If you were able to swim back to shore on your own and they didn't have to pick you up, then you were a good enough swimmer for these specialized divisions. He's not the only one who's shared that story, so I think there might be some truth to it. On the day of D-Day, the Americans decided not to send in divers with breathing apparatuses because the timing of the beaches at Omaha, or the timing of the tides at Omaha and Utah, meant that they were going ashore when the tides were fairly low. So pretty much everything that they needed to attack would be exposed. And so for that, they chose boots instead of fins. However, they all had these breathing apparatuses and their fins with them as they did it. They packed their masks and fins just in case the situation changed. They needed to pull those out of the boat and start to use this. They had recommendations for the amount of time they could spend underwater and the depth they could go to with the gas mixes that they had been provided. Those recommendations trace directly back to the research scientists in those labs at UCL who had done it first on themselves with bombs falling around them. This is the British version. And this photograph gets showed a lot because this is how they were equipped after D-Day. This was still a work in progress, but by 1945, the utility of these divers had been shown. The Brits sent them to the beaches of Normandy on D-Day. They were supposed to land in the fifth wave of troops. And their goal was, because the tides at Sword and Gold were a bit higher, they were going to be wrapping explosives around those infamous beach obstacles, those hedgehogs, and blowing them to pieces so they collapsed to the sand in order to continuously widen the available landing area. Now, a lot of that didn't end up working out just because there's so many ships coming in that the spinning propellers and the constant chaos made it a little bit difficult to try, or dangerous to try and do underwater. But what was important is that after that first pass of chaos went through, these are the personnel who were groping in the sand underwater with their bare hands, searching for bombs and ordnance that the Germans had left behind as traps. They had trapped not just the land, but the waters. So all of the obstacles that we see, from Saving Private Ryan, things like that, most of them had explosives on top. So here's when we just see a simple post with what's called a teller mine on top. And then you also see an area that the Germans themselves have clearly marked as littered with mines. All of these are now obstacles that will blow apart Allied soldiers as they try to make their march inland, even after the day of D-Day has passed. And more archives, shout outs. These are just some of the ordnance that the divers were pulling off of obstacles and from the water. They were held on with wire, they were held on with barbed wire. And as it becomes important to turn this into a proper port and then open other ports along the shores of France, these highly specialized divers using special breathing gas mixtures given to them by the Allied scientists, by the scientists led by JBS Haldane, are able to pull this ordnance out, diffuse it wherever possible, and many of them have these valiant stories of saving ports and harbors that would otherwise be turned into impassable wrecks because they were able to get to the bomb in time, take it apart, pull out the fuse, stop it from detonating. One of the things that I think is most incredible about this is not only do we know this story, or have we not heard this story before, because everything that these scientists did was classified until long after they were dead. Many of these documents were declassified as recently as 2001. Some others I had to request for the declassification review. The reason, so all of them stuck to their word, stuck to their policy, and never spoke about it, even to their children. It was only through the process of doing this archival work that I was able to bring this story out and tell many of these children for the first time what their parents had worked on during the war. But the thing that strikes me the most is that we don't hear as much about these divers of D-Day. They had zero diving related casualties. There was not a single diver whose dive plan went awry. There was not a single diver who had a seizure underwater. There was not a single diver whose breathing apparatus malfunctioned. And what we know now is that at the start of the war, they didn't have a clue. 1942, they were still struggling. Elizabeth German, her seizure in water, upended all of their scientific theory, and they had to repeat everything on themselves in a truncated timescale before the landings of D-Day. So these divers, dozens, if not hundreds of them, it's hard to count because they moved around between divisions a lot, were sent out there with high oxygen gas plants, with new rebreathers. None of them knew where this came from, and not a single one of them got hurt. Every single one of the scientists, however, did. So while this diver, Oh, I said, I'm sorry, my Zoom just disappeared on me all of a sudden. Am I back in? Oh, hey, Alex.
Hey there, how are you?
Um, I'm great. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
Yeah,
Good.
I'm good. I'm in England, by the way, so we flipped. But
Oh, wow. What are you
yeah,
doing?
I was just talking about how I think that this story really complements your book, Patton's Prayer, which I was really excited about, and then promptly left on my counter at home. Um, so I pre-ordered, very excited about it. Couldn't read it on the plane, immediately left it at home. But yeah, because these divers become so influential to this march inland as they're going through France and as they're trying to take this war to Hitler, sort of in his last refuge. They're needing to clear these ports and harbors to allow the Allies to bring equipment and supplies directly there. Otherwise, they'll have to keep bringing everything from Normandy and only Normandy. But as the Germans are retreating, every time they leave a port and a harbor, they leave behind booby traps. So these divers become incredibly critical to making those safe to use and safe to bring new things in for this then interminable march inland, because they don't want to make that even longer. So it's almost like two halves of the same effort of bringing these supplies to the harbor, and then your story, which is of course the long march inland. And I think that it's sometimes in a era of modern travel, it's easy to forget about that, right? So that
I
was
think if you,
essentially where, pardon?
sorry, I think if you'd sat down with, if you had sat down with George Patton in the fall of 1944, he would have said, Rachel, we need more divers. We need as many divers as we can get. Because, he was looking at the fact that finally he was slowing down because he was running out of gas. And that's, the broader issues, which are about the fact that the Red Ball Express is overextended and we just can't
Yeah,
supply the front lines.
absolutely. I think the phrase that an army marches on its stomach is so underutilized in terms of the magnitude of its importance, because so many World War II veterans have talked about this. I'm sure you've seen it in your research as well. There's this common story where they think they're starving, they're using their knives to make new notches in their belts. They're living off ration packs and things like that, because that supply chain issue is a huge one. And then, of course, many of them have the sobering moment of being participants in the liberation of the concentration camps, which is a harrowing perspective about food and rations. But yeah, so this is the final slide. I just kind of this, and I wanted to give your book a shout out as well, because I really appreciate your joining. But yeah, the moral of the story here for me is that all of these stories are stored in the archives. At some point, someone knew them, and it's my job, and I think Alex would probably say the same thing. It's our jobs to find these documents and bring these stories back, because there were incredible things that were done that were just classified at the time, and those things live now in archives. So
Well, I think you've done a fantastic job. I know that you were a very popular guest on our kind of, I hate to call it a show, but anyway, we had such a fantastic reaction to your appearance because, this is a story that no one's heard before. This is proper history. It's not just a rehashing of D-Day, which we've seen in the last week or so. And
yeah.
I think you made a really important contribution to really understanding what it took to launch that operation and why it was so difficult and therefore such an incredible achievement.
Yeah, thank you. That means a lot. Because I feel the same. I mean, we could sit here and compliment each other for hours. The but, yeah. Okay. Um, so yeah, oh sorry, I've just got a message. Can you adjust your screen a little bit? Because you're a little cut off. But so what are your thoughts about this idea of the supply chain being so influential? Like, what do you have any major pressing concerns that you think could have been done differently, or was it done the best for the situation possible?
Well, I think that what interests me is that there was an obsession about taking a port for obvious logistical reasons, and people tend to forget that Utah Beach was added by Montgomery. I should add, when he looked at the invasion plans, he significantly changed them, and people tend to forget that when they get lost in their kind of Brit bashing about Montgomery, who was a very difficult character. But point is that we were obsessed about Cherbourg, and right now, in 1944, 80 years ago, the Ninth Infantry Division and others are battling through the hedgerows in some of the bloodiest fighting for Americans in Normandy to try and get to Cherbourg. And yet, when they get there, the Germans have left the port unusable. They've blown up various ships, etc. And obviously, we had to use your amazing divers. But it seems to me kind of obvious that the Germans would do that. I mean, clearly, it was
I,
obvious. Don't you think? I mean,
yeah, I think that seems obvious too, especially because earlier in the war, they had already been doing that. So, like,
yeah,
as they retreated from Sicily and they went to mainland Italy, they had already established that they were not only going to blow a whole bunch of stuff up to try and make obstacles, but also leave behind as much ordnance as possible to create this sort of landmine attitude of no one will go here if it's too scary, which of course we all know now doesn't work because the officers just send the lower ranking. So
yeah.
yeah, I think that's
It seems amazing to me also, coming back to your question, that it wasn't until late 1944 that we actually had a port on the English Channel that was doing what we wanted it to do, and that was Antwerp. So
really
yeah, I mean, if you look at September, October into November of 1944, the big obsession for Montgomery, etc., was, why haven't we still got a major port? Um, it was Omaha Beach, actually. More material and men came across Omaha Beach until late fall of 1944 than any other place along the English Channel, which is extraordinary when you think about it. So
it is extraordinary. Yeah.
I do think, just like the aerial reconnaissance that failed before D-Day, and by that I mean that we didn't detect the fact that they had very high bocage, very high hedgerows, and that
Mm.
really impacted our ability to break out of Normandy. It seems to me that that was a major intelligence failure, or rather planning failure. Why didn't we get a major port sooner? It could have significantly impacted our progress toward Germany. Certainly, Patton, was sitting there every day in the fall of 1944, fuming about why he'd run out of gas.
That I think that's a really interesting point, and it makes me realize something that I've never thought about before, which is that in all of the planning documents I've read related to diving and ordnance and dive plans, which at this point is as many as humanly possible, I've never run into anything that was planning for sabotage of the harbors. It was just a thing where once they got over to France, the divers knew they would need to do. But all of the training documents focus exclusively on dismantling underwater obstacles. They don't even focus on the ordnance disposal or disposing of other types of obstacles like ships. I'm talking about like the planned for the hedgehogs. They didn't plan for ships to have been sunk. So yeah.
Something that I'm very interested in, that you might be
Um,
something that you might be able to help us with, is Um, what were the Germans like underwater? What were their capabilities? Were they sort of neck and neck with us in terms of technology? Where did they stand?
oh, they were ahead of us. I'm dying to find the German scientific records. So the Germans had a very similar breathing apparatus called the Tauchräder. Tauchräder. I apologize to German people. I gave my shot, but it's Tauchretter, and there's actually a surviving like very pristine quality specimen of one in Chicago, preserved with the U-boat there. I believe it's the U-505. So when the Allies, or when those sailors captured the U-boat, the German breathing apparatuses were on board. And so the Germans had been using these fairly successfully. Who was really ahead of us in terms of the underwater technology was the Italians. So I do think that there was probably a lot of communication from the Italians to the Germans, because the Italians were the ones that they still have huge amounts of data from using their underwater breathing apparatuses. They were riding on underwater torpedoes first. In terms of the context of the Allied countries, their first glimpse of swim fins, of foot attached swim fins, came from the Italians. And so I feel like I try to pick my language carefully, because I feel like someone has to have thought of that before, but the Brits in 1942 thought it was the first thing and the greatest thing they'd ever seen. So those people knew about it at that time. But yeah, so the Italians had done a lot of this experimentation in advance, and they were very clearly, based on the way they were using it, they were very clearly aware of some of these obstacles, like oxygen toxicity underwater. Obviously, Italy is a whole other archival trip, but I have been working in contact with the Italian Navy, and I hope to arrange that someday and go through their old records too and put together their timeline story.
Yeah, from my reading, it seems that the Italian Navy, or rather the underwater Italian Navy, was the one element of the Italian armed forces that actually was really advanced and caused us a lot of problems. You know, we weren't worried about the soldiers or their air force, etc., but you know, their underwater capabilities were significant.
Yeah, exactly right. Their underwater technology was spectacular. And actually, my mother's family is Italian, and my grandfather came over as a POW during World War II, having been taken prisoner in North Africa. And I think he would have very much agreed with you. His stories about the Italian military at the time were not, he wasn't a complainer, but they were not extremely flattering. But yeah, the Italians had, they were first doing the human-ridden torpedoes, which they called the maiale, and they had this incredibly successful attack at Alexandria, where with 6 divers and 0 casualties among their divers, they took out essentially the entire Allied Mediterranean fleet. And so that was Churchill's insistent boom. He was, copy this immediately.
So what was the most astonishing piece of information that you uncovered in the archives? What was there a moment when you thought, oh my goodness, this is amazing?
Good amazing or bad amazing? Both happened in
it could be
archives.
both. I mean, I don't mind. Was
Yeah.
something that you think, wow, this is going to be really cool in my book?
I think when I uncovered those reports with the photos of Dieppe, I was like, oh my gosh. That was a moment where I was like, I do a lot of internal screaming in the US National Archives. Like, there's excitement screaming. I have a lot of internal excitement screaming
Underwater
that I know I'm not allowed to let out. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Because I'll be shushed, rightfully so. But no, I think when I opened that and I read those reports and I realized that those were the official planning reports, and all I had were those 3 photographs, and I showed you the best one. I didn't cherry pick that one to make fun of it. That was such a moment for me where I was like, oh my God, the hubris of it, especially the retrospective view that we have of D-Day now. And we know the enormity of that undertaking. To imagine how flippantly they kind of attempted Dieppe only 2 years before really hit me. And that's when I knew that that was going to be the prologue. I was like, this is the story to open the book with. So
have you been surprised by how much media attention there's been for the 80th anniversary? Did you think it was going to be like this?
I was hopeful it would be like this. I don't think I've been surprised. I think I've been it's like third party flatter. You know, it's not about me, it's about the landing. I'm like flattered on behalf of the landing that it's still held in such high regard and such memory. because with historical events, a lot of the time people tend to forget as time goes by. And I do think this is probably one of the last, one of the last major anniversaries for D-Day where we'll have living veterans. So I've been really thrilled to see it going on. What about you?
Well, yeah, I am. I'm a veteran of D-Day for about 20 years now, but
Yeah.
I'm very pleasantly surprised that D-Day still gets such a lot of attention. Even the local media here in DC, there was a storm, and they always cover either death or storms, murders or storms. But they did turn up at the World War II memorial, which was good. I'm like, thank you. But
Great,
I
great.
was I'm kind of interested. What is it? What is there one thing that when you look at D-Day that you like to talk about most in terms of, look, hey, you've got to understand this about D-Day. Is there one aspect of it that you like to talk about, which is really underlines the magnitude of the operation?
Yes. My favorite aspect of D-Day is how they went in with like plan A, plan B, and then plan through N or O, right?
Right.
That's the thing that I think was a huge lesson learned that changed warfare. And now that's the norm. But at that time, you see the plans happening, and they're like, this is what we're going to try. We're going to bring this, and this just in case. And a lot of those backup plans ended up being used. And I think that's part of why the day was ultimately successful, was because they had all of a sudden started to plan for things going wrong. And I think that that's a really important thing that, again, now it's such a norm that we just assume it happened. But at least as far as I'm aware, that was one of the first major operations where that became a key part of the planning. Do you have one?
I I came across an interesting fact about D-Day, which was that the itinerary of items that they needed to use in the operation was over 70,000. So were you amazed at the logistical um, nightmare of planning an operation of that size? Are you still surprised that we were even able to get across the English Channel?
I'm not surprised we were able to get across the English Channel, but I am surprised at the number of documents that the leading officers actually read. Because you've seen them, these planning documents are hundreds of pages long. And those are the ones, like the specific beach ones are hundreds of pages long. Then they'll have the bigger ones, and there's so much documentation. They must have started, and then they changed it at the last minute, right? Like the last set of orders got changed a couple of weeks beforehand. So that amount of documentation, I'm surprised that people are able to follow it on any coherent level, because I live in piles of old documents and I don't know if I would be able to do it.
Yeah,
We do have an audience question in the chat. So it
sorry.
said, how long did it take? Oh, yeah, sorry. It said, how long did it take to research your book? I started this project in 2018, but I wasn't fully dedicated to it yet. So it's been 6 years from start to finish. But about a year and a half of that was waiting for the book to come out. So I would say, in terms of like fully intensive research, it was 2 to 3 years. Yeah.
So how did amphibious warfare change based on your research? I mean, after the Second World War, saying at Korea, were there lessons learned that you came across in the preparation for D-Day that were applied in further amphibious invasions, Korea being the perfect example?
I have not specifically looked into Korea. They were absolutely being applied by Vietnam. And what's interesting is, because the Germans were so far in advance, almost immediately the Americans started using the German breathing apparatuses. So one of the breathing apparatuses that we still use for the American and British militaries is German. It's Draeger. But yeah, in my opinion, this invented amphibious warfare in terms of the breathing aspects of it, not necessarily in terms of the landing aspects. But yeah, these breathing apparatuses appeared all of a sudden, or so it seemed, and then from there, they became a permanent fixture.
So in terms of research and development, if you think about Pearl Harbor being the 7th of December 1941 and the war is over in August of 1945, are you not astonished at all of the developments that occurred in that very short period, I mean, basically the time that Biden has been president, so many things were revolutionized. How could we develop things so fast, so quickly?
I don't know about you, but I think it's the power of having a common enemy. I think nothing unites humanity like a common enemy. And when we lack one, we tend to fabricate one, which can be problematic. But in this case, there was a very clear common enemy. And so all of a sudden, it was easy to get people to agree that ending the war, winning the war was the priority. And so I think that this shows the power of what creative people, unfettered by bureaucracy, can achieve.
How did they organize that bureaucracy, though? How did, at the highest levels, how did they allow the creativity to have impact?
I think that you're assuming they did organize it. So as far as it was, as far as they've been able to tell, it was essentially almost like little independent groups who were just like, well, this is a skill set we have, and this is important, so we're going to do it. Most of them that I found were never paid. A lot of them were struggling. They would get government reimbursement directly for supplies, or the government would buy their supplies. But even in the US, where the US was doing a lot of studying about aviation, I was thrilled the first episode of Masters of the Air really emphasized their breathing masks. Those were an active development point in the US, and people were doing the same kind of thing where they were testing it on themselves. And a lot of these people were actually breaking rules to do it. Like there's one guy who was like, oh yeah, but I stole the plane to go test it. Oh, okay. So I don't, and the governments had a very loose arrangement for being able to tell each other what they were finding. But as far as I've been able to tell, most of it occurred from the scientists just mailing it to each other, be like,
Wow.
hey, here's what we did. Yeah. Yeah.
I have one more question. I'm always fascinated by what I think is a major asset of the US military in World War II, which is its ability to adapt, both on the battlefield and away from it, which is what we're essentially talking about. Do you think culturally the US was more adaptable than certainly the Germans and other allied nations? Do you think there's something about meritocracy, about the lack of class structure in the US military, the promotion of more sort of American values, which is hard work, graft, and you get rewarded. You're not stuck at a certain pay level, etc. I mean, I would add to that that we would probably not, those of us in the US right now, not be in a republic if we just promoted George Washington. He was in the, he was in the colonial army, and you couldn't go beyond a major. Imagine if the Brits had just said, "Look, Washington, he's a fantastic officer. Let's make him a general." We'd be
Yeah.
we'd all be speaking the Queen's English now. But anyway, you get my point about this cultural.
It's possible. It's possible, but I think that can be selectively applied. So I think
Right.
it's a noble idea, and it's definitely the one to which, like, in my dreams, in my hopes, it's the one to which the US is trying to achieve, right? Like that, that's what I think is the goal. But it can be selectively applied at times. Like, for example, all of the amazing spies of Britain's SOE, all of the amazing female spies, most of them, okay, let me rephrase, all of the Americans who ended up working there for Britain's SOE, most of them were women who had been trying to support the war effort and were essentially given clerical jobs. And the UK was like, nah, we'll send you over. You could go to this. And they did some incredible acts of espionage simply because they were treated based on merit, and they were treated based on activity or ability. So yeah, the meritocracy, I think it's the American goal. But I'm not sure.
All our prejudices fall away when we're desperate, us limeys,
I think that's true of a lot of people. Yeah. Okay.
Well,
So I've got a message that it's time for us to wrap up, even though I personally could talk about World War II history with you all the time.
right.
But,
I've really
yeah.
enjoyed it, and I would say to everybody that's been watching, your book's fantastic. It's the best book and most innovative book about D-Day that has come along for a long, long time, and I've really enjoyed talking to you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. I really respect your writing, and I'm sorry I didn't get to read your book on the plane. I'm very excited for it when I get home. I'm sure it's absolutely marvelous. But yeah, and thanks, of course, to the National Archives for not only hosting us, but for hosting these stories until we could find them. So
definitely. Well, thank you. Thanks to the National Archives too. What an amazing, amazing institution. Thank you.